All right, welcome to our presentation about structural analysis. So this is the type of analysis that our group focused on within narrative research. So as we continue to go through today, we're going to talk a bit about some defining aspects of structural analysis. We're going to cover some information about the background, a couple of different approaches within structural analysis, and then we'll conclude with an opportunity for you all to practice it with an activity that we developed for this particular discussion. So what is structural analysis? So essentially how we consider structural analysis, it's different than how we typically think of how we analyze the data that we get from the stories that we hear from our participants. So instead of focusing on the content, the storylines of the participant, we're much more focused on how the story is being told instead of the content of the story. So in this regard, we're much more we kind of shift our perspective and our attention to the narrative itself, looking less at the words that they're saying and kind of the patterns within the words, I guess is a way to put that. Structural analysis is not as familiar as other thematic approaches, as we often use in qualitative research, though it's important to note that structural analysis can be used with other types of analysis approaches, such as like thematic narrative analysis. So some considerations of structural analysis. So here, why is, I guess, the question that we're looking for. Why do we consider structural analysis? And it's quite important when it comes to human communication just in general. When we think about how we understand one another, it's really strongly around how, not just what they're saying, but how they're saying it. How are they putting their sentences together? How are they putting their paragraphs together? How are they comprehending the stories that are being told? So one piece in particular is that differences in how we understand those things can impact how we are understood by others or how we're perceived by others. If the communication that's being kind of presented to us is unclear or disorganized in some ways that are different than what we kind of have grown up being used to being told about how we speak and talk and put those things together, that's oftentimes when people can be misconstrued as being cognitively disabled in some ways, or they might be considered deficient because they're not speaking in ways that we might be used to. So I think this is a really important thing to think about when we consider English as a second language, or when English isn't your first language just in general, or when we go, let's say we go to do research at other countries, like the way we're going to understand the stories of those participants will be very different than how we would understand the stories of those of us, those who grew up with similar ideas about syntax and how we tell our stories. So some background information here. Structural analysis was initially kind of developed as a way to try to break down and be more specific and structured of how do we talk, how do we tell our stories, what is the structure that we use linguistically when doing our research. And so the biggest pieces of this was really looking at like those kind of finding ways to code speech in some ways, and looking at kind of grammar and storytelling. And so it kind of shifted as we kind of moved forward to looking at story grammar versus just kind of what we think about in English class as grammar, and also looking at genre. So like the way we tell our stories might be different if we're talking about a different experience. Let's say I'm talking about learning about HIV status. The way I tell that story might be very different than the stories I tell about my childhood, which is a different genre, or the stories I tell about romance, romantic relationships versus friendships. So looking at that as a consideration as well. So eventually these types of analysis were considered within academia as time moved on. And I think one of the important pieces to note about this is as we continue moving forward, looking at racial injustices that happen within research, just kind of generally, and when it comes to understanding linguistics, this approach has a lot of really great ways of considering those things. So a little bit more about background. So these three people, Shirley Bryce Heath, Courtney Kasdan, and Sarah Michaels, were pretty instrumental in kind of forming structural analysis. They were their work was pretty foundational, and I won't go into the specifics about which each of their research areas was, but please feel free to go in and read more about that in the chapter, or hound one of us and we can answer more questions about that specifically for you. But these 3 individuals were really focused on looking at some of those racial injustices within linguistics, within environment, kind of considering power and using structural analysis as a way to kind of shift some of that. So the 2 types of approaches that we're really going to be digging into and giving you more explicit information about are going to be William Labov's approach and James Gee's approach, more specifically. So we'll start with William Labov's approach. So his approach was developed about 40 years ago and involves using pretty specific ways of forming language and forming stories and kind of analyzing these things. So when he initially did his research around examining what he labeled Black English, which was used among different youth within inner cities in the United States, and was really the primary purpose of his research was to challenge some of the perceptions and beliefs that people held at the time about Black children being unable or inadequate when it came to learning and logical thinking, because the way that they told their stories and their language was somewhat different than the run-of-the-mill or kind of mainstream way of communicating. So he did his research through peer groups and interviewing individuals. One of the big things about it is structural analysis breaks down the narrative into these particular types of clauses and these very specific. So you can see in this little image that we have here, there, and we'll go into the next slide. It will have a little bit more explicit information about what all those little abbreviations next to the lines are. But that's kind of how his approach works, of using these clauses or these ways of coding to understand the language and understand the story. So there are 6 main elements to his analysis approach. And so the first being the abstract. And so this is kind of like that main storyline. So what is the narrative about? And so here we have an example that is really specific to a patient not wanting to do surgery. So that's what all the examples are focused on. So example would be the participant saying, this is a patient, or this is stories about a patient who did not want to have any more surgery. The next piece that we have here, the next element, is orientation. And so this is looking at the who, the what, the where. And so this would be kind of getting those characters, the time, the place, the situation, context. So the example here we have is, when I came in that morning, she had been in the unit over a week. So we have the time, we have the person, we have the place. The next step then, or the next element, is the complicating action. And so this is the what happens then. So these are the things that kind of move the story along, like sequence of events and the climax of events that can happen in this. So again, the example, so I called the pulmonary fellow and told him of my concern. Then we kind of have the then what happens. And I really appreciate the evaluation piece, because this is kind of looking at the narrator or the participant's reflection of the events. So here the example is, her face was so broken down it was pathetic. And I think it's interesting that it was pathetic is his perspective or her perspective of the situation. So getting kind of that personal piece of what the narrator thinks about the story. We have the resolution. So how did the story end? What finally happened? And kind of the outcome of the plot. And so this would be, she passed away about 45 minutes later. And then the coda is kind of the end of the story. So bringing kind of all of that context back to the present, coming back to here's why we said the story, here's why we told you these pieces. And so now we tend not to go to the ethics committee because they were not helpful. Keep in mind that not all stories contain all of these elements, and they can occur in different sequences. So again, like I said, they might not contain all 6 elements of the story as well. They could be used differently by different researchers. So some researchers might focus on different elements and not others. They might be more specific to talk about others. They might be more specific in asking questions around that will elevate some of those elements more so than others. examining the sequence of this narrative is important for drawing the meaning. So why those codes are there is that we're really looking for the meaning from that one event through the stories of different participants. And another important consideration here is that this can be used as a way to triangulate, which is really important in qualitative research as a whole. It can promote validity and credibility. When trying to compare stories across a sample, it can be used in addition, as I mentioned earlier, with other types of analysis to kind of, again, strengthen the validity of the stories that are being shared. So James G's approach is a little bit different in a lot of ways. So it has really similar, it has some connections to the work that has already been discussed, Lebov's work, but he has some shifts and changes because they kind of grew out of Kasdan and Michaels in similar ways. So he was much more focused on looking at a way that accounted for people who told stories in ways that weren't as explicitly linear. So he did research with a woman who was in her 20s who had schizophrenia, and those who have pretty severe schizophrenia, they're tangential, they might repeat things, the focus might not be kind of how we consider stories where we kind of build up and there's a climax and then a resolution. It might be resolution, climax, climax, resolution. It essentially doesn't have that linear, temporally ordered way of being. And so his approach was really useful in trying to find ways to analyze different types of stories or even extended stories or narratives. Okay, so again, he was really focused on looking at a way, like doing research that wasn't so linear or progressive way of storytelling. And he drew upon, he was looking for a more broad and more encompassing way to consider different people's stories, which I think this particular approach could be really important when as I mentioned earlier, when thinking about exploring stories cross-culturally, where they might not have that same perception of this is how we tell stories, this is how we narrate what's going on, these are the particular, that might not fit quite into those, 6 elements that Lebov has outlined. One of the ways that research is done within this approach is that researchers have to listen to the recordings, and they're looking for different things than would be looked for in Lebov's approach more specifically. And so that's kind of the starting place, is you're looking at these stories that might be non-linear, that are complex, that are lengthy, and it starts by repeatedly listening to the story itself. The way that those stories are broken down then is to really specific units, looking at lines or stanzas. They give a great example in the book of having this one person's story almost thought of as a song and looking at the different stanzas. And so each line had its own meaning and each line had its own context, which would have been considered really differently when in comparison to Lebov's approach. I think I love this other piece here about looking at tone and pitch is important as the structures, as those lines and stanzas, and you have to pay close attention to that. Hence why you're listening to audio recordings over and over again, to really pick up on how a person is saying a particular piece and really understanding that it's really important. That might have more meaning than a line that might have been a word that was charged to us but didn't have the same experience for that person telling their narrative. So oftentimes if the transcripts are really difficult to interpret is when we have to construct boundaries, which is talked about in chapter 2. So moving right along, since we're running short on time here, we have a really lovely table that kind of compares the approaches of Lebov's versus G's, looking at the definition of narrative, the structure, the different units of analysis, and what we pay attention to. So here we have a story here that is by one of our group members, and we would love for you to spend time breaking up and attempting to do Lebov's approach. And so looking at these different lines, coming up with the different codes and looking at those different elements and seeing what you come up with here. And so again, this is something I'll have you read on your own, take a look at, and then on the next slide here we have some examples of what that looks like as well. So kind of giving you, if you needed some places to start to do that. A challenge, if you're up for it, is really seeing if you can come up with ways to do G's approach. If there's some ways that you'd be consider, like how, just even thinking about how would you consider this? How would you look at tone, since you only have a transcript, can be really tricky, but looking at some of these other things, like what might be some certain lines that stand out to you? What might be some stanzas that really feel really important? And so to conclude, again, the reason that we do this approach is it can look at really different voices and highlight things that we might not get to see otherwise in research. Thank you for your time.